So another boring food picture to start out the morning. Much more boring than the one last week. You can actually do some amazing things with vegetables. Which, growing up as a child, I never believed was a true statement. It's like, no, vegetables are horrible. Are we all there? I can't tell. And that's all that matters. Who's all here? Oh my gosh, there's only 4 of us. Okay, there we go. We are all here. Okay, so we started into the book of Daniel last week, and we're going to take it a little slow because Daniel's it's a fun book and it's an insightful book. It's one you can race through too fast and miss most of it. So we're slowing down a little bit. So let me just catch up on where we were before. If you remember, back about 5 centuries before Jesus, the Jews were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He came in, he rushed into what is present-day Israel, and he destroyed the place. And in fact, he took down the temple in Jerusalem, the temple itself, the temple built by David's son Solomon. So that very famous Solomon's temple, Nebuchadnezzar came in about 5 centuries before Jesus and just whacked that sucker flat, knocked down all the walls in Jerusalem so it was defenseless, and then took away people as slaves, because that's what you did during those days. You not only took their goods in the area that you conquered them, but you took people with you so they could be your dishwashers and the people who work your fields and stuff like that. So they took all the Jews out and took them to be slaves. That happened, and we are actually at the beginning of that story about taking people away. And in that taking people away, the king also decided what he needed to do was find some really sharp people. I mean, sharp people who could actually help in the administration of the superpower of the day, which was Babylon. He needed sharp people to work at high levels who were, it said originally, and when we read last week, it said they were people who were skilled in wisdom, they were skilled in knowledge, and guess what? Skilled in science. So he said, find some people who can do this, and don't get the old people, get the young people, because what we need to do is retrain them, because they need to learn the Babylonian language, Chaldean. They need to learn Babylonian language, and we need to teach them the ways of Babylon, and we need to incorporate them into the structure of our state. So find the sharpest people. So they took youth out of the highest placed level social in the country, in Israel at the time, and said, let's groom these folks to be people who will actually help administrating the superpower of the world, Babylon. And in that group was a youth by the name of Daniel. He was one of these sharp kids. So that's what we got last week. And in the process of doing that, the king said, okay, I'm going to give you 3 years. I'm going to give you 3 years, and what I want you to do is learn the language. Have you ever learned the language in 3 years? Learn the language, learn our culture, learn everything it takes to run our country. And if you do that, and if you get up on our literature and our customs and all that kind of stuff, and most importantly, you are able to stand before the king and give an account of your work, which is a big deal because they would have to stand in front of Cyrus, who was in charge of the only superpower of the world. So they were going to be like cabinet positions in the presidency today. These youth are going to be that. So he says, I give you 3 years, learn the language, learn the culture, and then in 3 years, you're going to come and stand before me. And if you can stand before me and prove to me that you're going to be an asset to the kingdom of Babylon, you're in and we'll put you to work. And in order to make this good, to give you the best advantages possible, I'm at great expense to me, the king says, I am going to give to you the same food that I eat at my table. You're not going to be scrounging for food. You're going to eat like kings, literally. And with that great food and 3 years of tutorial training and the eunuchs helping you, then we'll get there, and then you'll stand before me and we'll have like a final exam and figure out if you've passed. And that's where we are. And we're just in the first half of the first chapter of Daniel. So here's the recap where we left it last week. Daniel had a problem with the food part, kosher food laws. So we read last week, this is from last week, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, we took a vote right here about what he should do. But before we voted, we looked at this passage from Jeremiah 29, which is fascinating. Fascinating. Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles who were taken to Babylon, including Daniel. He writes a letter, and then he writes this letter for us in Jeremiah 29. And by the way, I said you need to read Jeremiah 29. Some of the most memorable and often quoted verses that Christians use come from this letter that was sent to Babylon to talk to the Jews in exile. From that letter. You need to read specifically verses 11, 12, 13. Yeah, 11, 12, and 13 in chapter 29 of Jeremiah. And in verse 12 of Jeremiah 29, he reveals that they're only going to be in Babylon for 70 years. So anyway, in that letter, he gave them 3 things to do, and the third one was this. Seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, on behalf of the Babylonians. Amazing. For in its welfare, you'll find your welfare. So clearly the instruction from Jeremiah, actually from God through Jeremiah's pen, is now that you're in exile, now that you're living there, you need to exist for the benefit of the nation I put you in. So when we came back to our vote, we looked at this and said, well, it can't be A, because he doesn't kill the eunuch. He doesn't escape. He doesn't go on hunger strike, right? I would like to serve the king, but I'm never going to eat that food. I'm going on hunger strike, and if you don't change my food diet, then I'm just going to die. Doesn't do that. In fact, we voted that it's none of the above. And so I said in a teasing way, we'll find out today what they did. You have to act like you've never read Daniel before, because you'll be surprised. So what do you do instead, right? What do you do instead? Because Daniel wanted to honor God's constraint on the Jewish food laws, but he also, because of Jeremiah's advice, wanted to be to the benefit of Babylon and to Cyrus the king. So how do you reconcile those two? Because the king has given you this food to make you successful. So this is what he does. We pick up today. So verse 8 of Daniel 1. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. So he doesn't, you see how soft this is? He doesn't say to him, we're going to go on strike, or we're going to, subvert the kingdom, or you're going to have to kill us because we're not going to do that. He doesn't do that. He's trying to balance this idea that he needs to serve the people in Babylon, while at the same time he's good to God in terms of his food laws. So he asked the eunuch, the guy who's in charge of him, he asks them, is there a way we can do this to allow me not to defile myself? So he's not saying he doesn't want to serve the king, or he doesn't want to be the benefit of Babylon. That's what Jeremiah said to do, be a benefit to them. But he said, but we also got to figure out a way. I don't want to defile myself in doing this by eating the king's food. That's just an honest conflict of terms right here. I mean, what am I supposed to do? So he brings us up to the eunuch. Now, the eunuch had the power, if he wanted to say, you insolent little twerp kid, and just cut him down on the spot. Now, it would not have worked well, because the king chose Daniel and his friends. So he'd have to answer to the king when the king said, hey, what about that Daniel kid? He seemed pretty sharp. Oh, well, he was insolent, so I just killed him. No, because then the eunuch would be killed too. So that's not going to work. So Daniel is just basically saying, we got a problem here. I want to participate, but I also want to honor God. So what are we supposed to do about it? So he lays that in the eunuch's lap. How do we do this? Well, in between, we read that God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. These are the guys taking care of him. So God has gone ahead already and softened the heart of this guy in charge of Daniel. He's gone ahead already, and he's made a way for this to get reconciled, because God supernaturally is working in the heart of the people who are in charge of him. So then it goes on in verse 10. We work toward a solution. So the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, since Daniel had brought up his problem, now the eunuch's going to bring up his problem as we're working this out. And he said to Daniel, look, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. The king told me to give you this food. The king told me, and I'm the king's servant, right? Also, for why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age, so you would endanger my head with the king? Head in terms of dead, right? So he's saying, look, here's the constraint I've got, Daniel, while we're all laying our cards on the table. You don't want to defile yourself, Daniel, but look, I am the servant of the king. and I was told to give you the king's food at great expense to him so that you'll have the maximum chance of passing the final exam in 3 years in front of the king. And what happens if I change your food now and you look worse than the kids who are eating the good food? What's going to happen? I'm going to die. My head will roll. So Daniel shows his problem. The eunuch shows his problem. We don't have a solution yet, but everyone's willing to work for Cyrus the king. To get to his stuff. The eunuch wants to make sure he serves the king. Daniel wants to serve the king. They both have problems with this food issue. So how are we supposed to do this? So then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So Daniel thinks, okay, wait, let's see. What can we do here? I know what we'll do. This is what we'll do. So Daniel, nice picture of Daniel. Daniel says, okay, why don't you test the servants for 10 days? Test your servant, he's talking about us. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And that's why we have the vegetable picture at the beginning. But he says, let's do a test. Let's try it for 10 days and just see how it works out. And he goes on and says, then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. So let's do a test. After 10 days, I'll do my diet. You let those other guys do their diet. And after 10 days, you look at us and you judge how things have worked out. And oh, by the way, then at that point, you're still in charge. And then you can deal with your servants, Daniel and Hananiah and the friends. You can deal with your servants according to what you see. So you can see fit to do what you want to do after that point. In likelihood, since Daniel, the repercussions, Daniel wants to, above all, serve God well. He will probably say, I cannot eat the king's food. And that might put his life in danger, and that might take his whole future and put it in danger. He's got to stand his ground because you've got the will of the king, you've got the will of God, and Daniel's going to go for the will of God. It could be ugly after this point. So Daniel says, let's hang the entire thing on a 10-day diet. And at the end of which, me and Hananiah and my friends might all be killed. But let's just try it. Come on, Mr. Eunuch, what have you got to lose? Because we've got 3 years. This is at the beginning of the 3 years. Let's do a 10-day test at the beginning of the 3 years, and you be the judge about whether this diet makes us more healthy or not. Because the king really wants us to be maximally healthy. That's why he's giving us his food. So if it turns out that this diet makes us more healthy than the other people, then you're still serving the king because you're keeping us healthy, although you're not using his food. See? It's brilliant. Because what we're doing is we're really serving the king's intents, but we're not following his rules with the food. Okay. So let's do a test. So he listened to them, the eunuch listened to them in this matter, and he tested them for 10 days. 10 long days, all they ate was vegetables. And so I call this the miraculous 10-day diet. But let me ask you something. What are the chances that after 10 days he's going to look any different? Think about this. Unless you're someone who's used to eating donuts every day, maybe if you don't eat donuts 10 days in a row and you stop doing that, maybe you'll look different. I don't think so. Would you? Oh, you can't.
When my dad met my mom,
Yeah.
he was painful, and he didn't eat very many vegetables. And then they got together, and he started eating vegetables, and it became a different person.
Wow.
Yeah.
It is possible. But I just want to put this in perspective. Many times for us, when we participate in a diet we see on YouTube or something like that, and you give it 10 days, you don't know why you haven't lost 10 pounds or whatever it is you're. So, but this is really a great gamble because the entire future of Daniel and his friends pivots on the 10-day test. Pivots. It's a big deal. But before we get to the conclusion, and you probably know what the conclusion is, but before we get to the conclusion, you have to understand what a clever, I don't want to say clever, what a sharp kind of proposal this was. Because Daniel went one step beyond, well, the king says you eat this food, and says, why? Well, because what the king wants isn't for me to eat this food. He wants us to be maximally healthy, because we're going to contribute to his kingdom and running the kingdom. He wants us to be effective. And in his mind, the most effective way to do that is to eat his food. So Daniel goes one step above that and says, I'm still going to serve King Cyrus, but I'm going to serve him in a way that seems like we're ignoring his dictate about food. But I'm still serving the king's ultimate desires. And that's a very diplomatic and insightful way of solving the problem. We'll come back and talk about that later. So the 10-day diet. Well, at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. You're not as excited as I am. I mean, this is not only better in appearance, but they're fatter. They're fatter, and they're eating broccoli or stuff, right? I mean, this is really astonishing. So the ball goes back in the eunuch's court, and he looks and he compares the youths of the same age who are eating the king's food. He compares Daniel, Hananiah, all those guys. He goes, well, you know what? I think you're onto something here. Okay, it looks like I'm not going to fear for my life with the king if I let you guys eat your food, right? And he proved it. So the steward took away their food, the king's food, and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them broccoli. No, actually, broccoli's not in the text. It says vegetables, but I had to put in the broccoli. And so he let them eat vegetables. For the eunuch, this was a risk. This was a risk. And this is where God had worked in his heart prior to that to give him compassion. And I mean, this was a risk because if it turned out that in the end, after 3 years, what if a 10-day test didn't go for 3 years? What if they actually got more sickly? What if they just got a bad flu and they never came back from it? I mean, what if they looked anything less than the best of healthy when they stood in front of Cyrus, and Cyrus could say, Mr. Eunuch, what did you do wrong? Did you give them my food I told you about? Well, no, I didn't. Off with his head. So this is a risk. This is a risk for the eunuch. But he stands back and he goes, well, I can't deny the test. There's the test. So you've proven it. I want you to be very healthy. That's what the king wants. And it looks like you've got a better solution than the king had. We'll go with that. Good deal, Mr. Eunuch. Okay. So as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. So now we've moved to what's going to happen during the 3 years of training. Okay? Eating God's food, yes, but they're 3 years of training. And God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Whose literature? Babylonian literature. He gives them learning and skill in Babylonian literature, but in wisdom, godly wisdom. God gives them this. So Daniel also had a skill. He had understanding in all visions and dreams. Ooh. Okay, this is interesting. The other guys have skills that we understand. They're conversant in the culture, the literature of the culture. They're more and more conversant about the wisdom of God. Again, these are probably adolescents. That's a miracle all in itself. Okay? But they're up on this. I mean, it's clear you can talk to them, and these kids are on the ball. They're on the ball. But for David, the skill that God gives David isn't that. He gives him an understanding of visions and dreams. Wow. Now, if you've read Daniel, you'll see why this is important. Because the rest of the book is a lot about Daniel interceding on behalf of Babylon and through an understanding from God about the dreams that King Cyrus has. Fascinating. Visions and dreams. So now we're at the end of 3 years. We're at the final exam. Now it's sink or swim. Now the king is going to ask, how did it go? Now, by the way, the king right now is Nebuchadnezzar, not Cyrus. And I'll show you about that in just a second. But it's Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one who took him into captivity. Final exam. Final exam happens. Verse 18. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the one who trashed Solomon's temple, broke down the walls of Jerusalem, hauled off people into captivity, death and destruction, raping and pillaging. That Nebuchadnezzar. Now you're going to stand in front of the superpower king of the world. And we'll just see if you measure up. We'll see if you can be part of my cabinet running the biggest superpower of the world. I would be a little nervous. So the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. Yeah, they passed the test. And by the way, that last phrase is not a throwaway phrase. They stood before the king. Because they stood before, you know what you do when you come in front of the king who's in charge of the whole world? You kneel and bow to the ground. Even conquered foes would come in and kneel and bow down or prostrate themselves on the ground. The king of the world at this time, Nebuchadnezzar, would sit on a throne which is deliberately lifted higher so that no one in the room was higher than the king. And so for you to acknowledge the fact that he is the man in control, you would go low, he would stay high. But in this particular case, these youths, after the 3-year training program, they stood before the king. It's a great statement of the king's respect for them and their own confidence in what God had done in them. They stood before the king. Normally, an insolent person who stood up and stood before the king would be killed instantly. If you remember the story of Esther, it's worse than that. Not just standing before the king. You can't even come into the king's presence without him asking you in. You can't barge in and say, I've got an item to put on the agenda for today. Swing, no head. So coming into the presence of the king is a gigantic deal. And you would be low to save your life, but they stood because they passed. And they were soon going to be in his cabinet. Wow, they stood. By the way, that stood, if you can almost substitute the word withstood. They withstood the king. And you get an idea of how it's like. So verse 20. Well, about this final exam. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, and he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. And you can imagine that Nebuchadnezzar could ask them some pretty complex questions, right? This guy is dealing with running the world right here. He could ask them great stuff, trick questions, questions that you could only survive if you had a fundamental knowledge and an understanding of the issues of the question, and then have a sharp, clever, insightful solution to the question. That's the wisdom part. I mean, if you're like 15 years old, could you do this? What if you were dragged in front of the President of the United States? He says, we need your help on some very thorny issues. Okay, so how are you going to solve, the President would ask you, how are you going to solve the Middle East conflicts going on right now? Take it away. Well, it would need a fundamental understanding of what the problem is and why they're fighting each other, how long it's been going on, what are the details, what have you tried to do? You have to have a great understanding, a broad understanding. And then in a spark of inspiration, you have to say, I've got it. Have you thought of doing this? And the king would take a couple steps back, the president would take a couple steps back and go, that's brilliant. That's what these kids did in front of Nebuchadnezzar. That's what they did. And why? Because they were essentially sharp kids? No, he told us earlier in the passage this morning, because God did this in them. God trained them up like this. God actually equipped them for being able to be helpful in the kingdom of Babylon. It said that before. Remember the wisdom and the understanding and the knowledge? And he selected them if they understood science. And in Daniel somehow passed this test, although his real skill was on visions and dreams. He'll pass that test pretty soon. So they're in. And then we'll quit with this verse today, because it's verse 21. Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Wait, I thought we were talking Nebuchadnezzar. Yes. But this is a way in which, in the Daniel narrative right here, he wants to give you an understanding about how successful Daniel and his friends were in the kingdom. And this is how he states it. He says, Daniel was there. Where's there? Babylon. But now, not Babylon, but now Persia, because King Cyrus is the king of Persia. Now, if you remember, we looked at this when we looked at Ezra and Nehemiah. Babylon was the Mesopotamian Valley and everything else in the world. Its headquarters was the Mesopotamian Valley, present-day Iraq. That's where they were. Tigris, Euphrates River, that's where they were. But somewhere along the line, during the reign of the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar and his successors, they got taken over by Persians. The Persians came from the north, present-day Iran. I went to school in grad school with some foreign guys, and one of them was from Iran. And I said, so what are you? Are you Arabian? And he would like spit on the floor and say, no, I'm not Arabian. I'm Persian. Persian? Persian. I'm Persian. So Persians are different than that. So Persians from the north came in. They overpowered the Babylonians. They took over the Mesopotamian Valley, and everything else that the Babylonians owned were now Persian. It was like someone changed the mortgage, and now they own the house. So the Persians are in, King Cyrus. Well, now, wait a second. So when did that happen? Well, remember, Daniel was taken away to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. And the date of that, which is pretty well received by almost everyone, is 586 BC, right? And 586 BC, the siege that happened in Jerusalem and the invasion that came from the Babylonians in Jerusalem happened over about a decade's time in terms of the original onslaught and then taking people away. I mean, it took several years. But everyone agrees that on 586 was when the temple itself was knocked down by Nebuchadnezzar. 586. So when we looked in Ezra, for instance, and Ezra's big thing was to rebuild the temple, it was rebuilt in 516. It was exactly 70 years later. Like Jeremiah said, you'll be there 70 years. But wait a second. So what's the time frame between King Cyrus of Persia and King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon? And this is what he's trying to get at, that everyone would have common knowledge of, but we don't. King Cyrus, his first year was 539 BCE. You remember in BC, it numbers backwards. It's like negative numbers of years. So it turns out, are you doing the math yet? The difference between those 2 years is 47 years. 47 years. So the narrative we were just reading was when the youth were brought into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar right at the time that they were taken captive out of Egypt. That was very close to 586, somewhere in there, plus or minus 5 years. And yet here we are. Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus, over 4 decades later. So what he's trying to say in this statement was, we just had the final exam of the youth, and you know how well they did, not only just the final exam 3 years into their captivity, but over 4 decades later, Daniel is still there doing wise things for the king. 4 decades later. And not just Nebuchadnezzar and the kings that came after him in Babylon, but even for the conquering king, King Cyrus. He's still there for this. So not only did he pass the final exam, but he passed the exam every year for 4 decades. He was useful to the king. And not only that, we'll find out in a second, the amazing thing is that when Cyrus comes in and wastes the Babylonian leadership, including Nebuchadnezzar's successor and all that kind of stuff, normally a conquering king would come in and take out all the leadership, because if you leave them around, they'll be plotting how to get back in power and how to assassinate Cyrus and his friends. I mean, you get rid of all those people, but somehow and some way, and the somehow is God's influence, Cyrus does not kill the upper cabinet of the youths that were trained out of Israel. He keeps them. They're in favor. What? Now, that's not only amazing, but it explains an issue when we started into Ezra. And I'll show you in a second here. So Persia knocks off Babylon. King Cyrus is in place. And then look at this. 11 months ago, we started the book of Ezra. And this was the first day. And the first day as we started Ezra starts off in the same way. Ezra 1:1. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. It's the same thing in Daniel. In the first year, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Right, Jeremiah? The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. And then it goes on in that passage, and we looked at, Cyrus says, these Jews who we have now inherited after we took over Babylon, these Jews, they need to go back and rebuild their temple. They need to replace the Solomon's temple that Nebuchadnezzar took down 6 decades ago. We need to have them do that. And so Cyrus, and that's the story of Ezra. An amazing story. And so as you start into Ezra, you go, how did Cyrus become so positive toward the Jews that he said, you guys need to go home and rebuild your temple. How is that possible? Well, the influence of God is one thing, but don't discount over 4 decades of influence of Daniel prior to Cyrus. 4 decades. Okay, let's do some wrap up, because this is what's fun about Daniel. We didn't cover much today, but we looked at the final exam, and actually this isn't the final exam, but this is our ongoing daily pop quizzes in life that we experience. How are we supposed to interact with a culture that is evil, that has more power than we have? How are we supposed to interact? And how do we take to heart Jeremiah's admonition, God's admonition through Jeremiah's pen, that what we need to do is we need to pray for the good of the culture we live in, and we need to act in a way that's beneficial to the culture while not compromising on our service to God. How do you do that? And I'll give you a big example at the end of this. So I'll just pull out a couple of points. Number one, I call this the Daniel influence. How did Daniel influence his culture for God? Because clearly God used that in King Cyrus, the conquering king, to be positive toward the Jews. I mean, it's an amazing thing. The Daniel influence, number one, is this Jeremiah 29 thing. The letter that Jeremiah wrote to Daniel and all the exiles in Babylon. What you need to do, he says, is you need to seek the welfare of the city, that is Babylon. You need to actually be engaged for their good, right? Don't be in an evil foreign culture and basically not be here to benefit it. God has placed you specifically in where you are at so that you can be an agent of good from God's perspective in that culture. Yeah, but they're evil. Well, God knows that. By the way, before you became part of God's family, God looked at you and said you were evil. So he doesn't see us really any differently. So God so loved the world that he sent his son. And the so loved the world people is Babylon there. And it's the culture we live in here. We have to constantly be thinking, God put me here for a reason. My presence here is not an accident. This time and this place is a way in which God can glorify who he is by how I react in this culture. And that was Daniel's experience. We just take that to heart. Also, we need to maintain in that process that we seek God's will above the king's will, above everything else. God's will and God's dictate, they're the tops. So when there's a conflict, you have to obey God first. That's just super important. That's a super important thing. Because after all, that's how you're going to have any kind of godly influence in an evil culture, is if you reflect who God is. So live a godly life in the midst of a dark place, lights in dark places. So you have to have God's will and God's expectation of our living righteously and like him. That's got to be a big deal. And somehow you have to make those two work. So in order to make those two things work, then you have to really deeply understand in the culture you're in what their concerns are and what their needs are. Now, did he do this with that eunuch? Daniel said, here's my concern. I want to serve. It's an honor in a sense to serve Nebuchadnezzar, but I've got to honor God first above him. I've got a food law problem right here. We need to figure this out. But you need to start with understanding the concerns and needs of the culture that you're in. How can you be a light in a place that you don't understand? This is principally why when missionaries are sent out, Christian missionaries are sent out all around the world, and we've been in contact with many of them, and we prayed for one this morning. When they send out around the world, the biggest mistake you can make as a new missionary in a foreign culture is to try and do stuff without understanding the culture, without understanding what their concerns are, what their needs are, what they deal with. I mean, all those things. You've got to come to a great understanding. But wait a second, this is an evil culture. Why should I study an evil culture? Because you need to understand the people in that culture if you're going to be useful there. So that's what Daniel did. Daniel heard the eunuch say, well, listen, Daniel, I understand what you're saying, but I could lose my life if I do what you're asking me to do. He heard that need, and he put it together in his head, and then God gave him an insight wisely how to do it, and devised a win-win solution that serves. Win-win, it wins for Daniel, kosher laws. It wins for the eunuch because he's taken the best care of the people that the king had selected. It's a win-win. but it's not an obvious solution. And I think in this particular case, and in our case as well, win-win solutions are something that come from God. When you say to God, and this has happened to me, God, I want to do well here. I want to be a light here. But I want to serve you, and I don't know how to make both of those coexist. I don't know how to make those coexist. I've got a problem here. So God, you need to give me wisdom up beyond my abilities. And I believe that's what happened to Daniel right here. That's what happened here. Devising a win-win that serves. Then at that point, you have to trust in God's provision. Will the 10-day diet work? Will God actually allow for 3 years, me and my friends to learn enough Babylonian that we don't lose our heads in front of the king? I mean, how's this going to work? Well, they relied on God's provision. And Daniel is very clear when he writes this to say, it's God's the one who trained up these youth. God's the one who really came up with all the wisdom, including the win-win solutions. Got to rely on God. So once you're in that culture that's so different, rely on God to lead you and to provide solutions. Trust in God's provision. And then finally, there's a lot of points you could make from this. You need to glorify God in the results. Now, we didn't see much of that here yet, but as we go on in Daniel, I want you to keep an eye out for when things that happen that are a result of Daniel's wisdom or Daniel's insight into some of the dreams and visions. I want you to observe, does Daniel take credit for that, or does Daniel give God the credit for that? Because that's important, because in the culture that we find ourselves in, if we can be beneficial to this culture, and then somehow someone comes back to you and says, why are you doing this? And how did you come up with this idea? You can say, well, God led me to do that. It's God's wisdom. It's not mine. So God needs to be glorified through all of this. That's the influence that you have. Instead of getting up on your soapbox and saying, yeah, that was me. I'm pretty smart, and I'm wise beyond my years. No, you don't want to do that. You need to give God the glory for all that stuff. Okay, let me give you an example, because this happened to me not too long ago. Brigham City got its LDS temple in 2012, and there was an open house, which was always the case, from the middle of August to the middle of September in 2012, and myself and some other friends of mine in the state decided we'd like to just maybe hand out some materials and engage conversations about temples from a biblical perspective, just to kind of jog some thinking about this. Because in the end, tens of thousands of people came into town to tour the temple. I toured the temple. Dorothy and I toured the temple. In fact, an odd kind of side note, I got a call from an old Hewlett-Packard coworker that I'd worked with decades before, who lives up in Idaho, lives in Rexburg. He's a professor at the college up there. And he called me up and said, I'm coming down to Brigham City, and I'm going to tour your new temple. Would you like to go through it with me? He's a wonderful, delightful man, LDS. I just love him to death. I said, sure, I'll go through with you. I hadn't seen him in decades. And we went through the temple. Well, here's the conflict that came up. We went out and just started mingling with people who were going into the temple. But if you see on the bottom of that picture, the west entrance to the temple is the garage, the underground garage entrance to the temple. And everyone who was going to tour during the open house was going to go through that garage entrance on the west side. Everyone. There was no other entrance. And so, well, okay, we can do that. So we started to go out and just engage in people in light conversations. We weren't protesting. We weren't demonstrating. We were just engaging in conversation and handing out materials. And here's some of those materials. In fact, if you want to see what we were handing out, there's copies over under the bulletin board on the bottom shelf on the far left over there. And all it does is that, it just talks about temples. It just talks about temples. So we are engaging people, and then suddenly we found out that we were violating a law. So we came back over to the police department over here. We said, hey, people over at the temple say we're violating a law by talking to people on the sidewalks. We're not on private property, we're on sidewalks. And we just want to talk to people. And so they said, oh yeah, you gotta fill out a free speech application. And so here's a copy of my free speech application that I submitted. And they said, you put in there, you describe what you want to do. I said, well, we want to do hand distribution of literature to voluntary recipients. And the literature respectfully presents biblically based information about temples in the Old Testament and related Christian topics. Call my personal cell for more questions. This permit application here is resulting from discussions with Sergeant Fertig of the police department. And so there you go. And then it says, on the map provided, please highlight the route or areas you actively will cover. And we just said we're doing hand distribution of literature exactly like missionary tracting. Well, that's what missionaries do for the LDS Church. They tract, they hand out tracts. So I submitted that. They okayed it, and they allowed us to actually be on the sidewalks again. We couldn't be on sidewalks. However, there was a restriction, and here's the restriction. These red bars are the only sidewalks we could be on. And if you know, there's the west entrance again right there. So we could only be on those places. We couldn't be anywhere on this block where the west entrance, where everyone was going into tour. Well, that was a problem. And that problem sort of looked like this. Here's actual data. There's the west entrance right there. Maybe a little dim to see, but down here are all the buses, because the idea was, and this is always the case, is that there's not enough parking right there for people who want to tour. So you would park down closer to 1100 South and the old Kmart / now apartments in the parking lot there, and then they would have shuttle buses that would come up and they would unload right there in that block at the west entrance, go from the buses right here and then go into the west entrance and then come out to the buses and then leave. So it turns out that the parts of the sidewalks that we wanted to engage people on, no one was there. And here's if you look down here, a couple of my friends, Rob and Eric, are down there, and they're at the extent of their closeness that they can get to the people down here. Couldn't talk to anybody. And I decided, it's not good. I need to do something kind of like Daniel would do. So I went to the king. So I went to the mayor of Brigham City. I went to his office and I sat down and I said, we're abiding by your rules about the free speech laws, what sidewalks we can and cannot be on. We're doing that, but it's not satisfying to us in terms of our call from God just to talk to people and talk about biblical issues. And so I asked him, just right over in the mayor's office up there, it's in the second floor right at the street. And I asked him, I said, is there a way, I know you've got this law in the books, can we just relieve that law? Don't take it off the books, but just don't enforce it. Because of this situation, we can't talk to anybody. And it's not you're not serving us by what's going on right here. And he says, well, put it in writing and I'll get back to you. And then after he said that, he says, and oh, by the way, while we're talking, what can I do to help you move out of your building and move somewhere else in town? Which came to a head exactly a calendar year later when they tried to take our building. But his mind was on other things. So it turns out that in that interim, when I realized he really wasn't going to do anything, I prayed and said, God, I want to participate with the mayor, but you clearly, unlike Cyrus, you have not softened his heart, or Nebuchadnezzar. So, what am I supposed to do? I don't have a wise solution to all of this. I called some pro bono, some free legal services that are Christian across the country, and said, this is just really clearly a violation of First Amendment laws. You can't restrict access on sidewalks. It's literally by definition a public space. Sidewalks are. And they said, yeah, you're right, but you know what? Oh, we're too busy. We can't help you. And so they said, but I'll tell you what, there is an option if you're willing to stomach it. And I said, what's my legal option? And they said, well, you can call the ACLU. And they love free speech issues because that's how they were founded. And this is just a classic down the center of the road free speech issue. So call him up. And he said this could get interesting. And it was. So I called up, a Christian pastor called up the ACLU in Salt Lake City. And I got in touch with their lawyer, a lovely man. I just fell in love with this man. John was just a great guy. And I told him my situation. He says, you're right. That's a classic violation of First Amendment. I think we can do something on your behalf to try and coerce them to let you to talk to people, because First Amendment, governments cannot restrict the free expression between people. That's just wrong. So he took our case and worked on it for a while. And the day before we were headed to federal court in Salt Lake City, because this is a federal offense. It's a First Amendment of the Constitution problem. We were going to federal court. they finally settled with our lawyer right over here in the offices. They settled, and they said what we'll do is we'll take that part of our municipal code that says you can't be on the certain side. We'll just rip it out of the municipal code, and you'll be free to be out there, and you'll be okay. Well, okay. But in that phone call from the lawyer John, he says, I'm here in your city offices right now, talking to your city manager and your mayor and all these other people. There were 4 people implicated in the lawsuit with 12 counts. 4 times 12 is 48 counts. And so he says, we're ready to go. They're going to take this code off, but to free you. But he says, there's one thing getting in the way. So I'm calling you to see if you'd be willing to be flexible. And I said, what's the flexibility? He says, well, when we wrote up the lawsuit, you always have to have a monetary thing on the counts, 48 counts. So you said you don't want to make any money on this. Most people would put in, $1,000 per count. And when they win, you would score a lot of cash. I said, we don't want to do that. But he said, I had to put something in, so I put $1 in for every count. So there's $48 on the line right now. The city will not pay you $48. I said, what? And then John said a marvelous thing. He says, they must really hate you if they're not willing to pay $48. So he's saying, I'm calling you right now, Jim. Would you forego the $48? I said, sure. So he says, okay, I think we got a deal. So then they took the municipal codes off the books, and then we were allowed to actually go there. So these guys, my friends and myself, I was there many days as well. There's a blow up of them. By the way, this guy right here in a white shirt was one of the people who was managing the whole open house to make sure that these guys didn't go down that block. And there was a guy on the other end as well, making sure people didn't go up the block. Well, so after the decision, we were allowed to move from this closest position to people to all the way to be in the midst of where the people are. And we had just a couple of days to actually talk to people. I had some great conversations. Great, really wonderful conversations. Some of the best conversations I've had with some of my LDS friends and neighbors. Really nice. And so here's a picture of me doing this with a couple of missionaries that were there, wearing coincidentally the same shirt I'm wearing today. I did that on purpose. These 2 missionaries are really great guys. One of them was from the Midwest. The other guy was from Hawaii. And interestingly enough, the Hawaii guy is not the guy on the left. It's the guy on the right. I know you were thinking that. So anyway, this is the outcome of that. And we just had great stuff. But it was one of those sort of Daniel moments for me because I wanted to be faithful to God. We were respectful when we talked to people. And we had some great conversations when we talked about temples with these. Great conversations. I had some people just have some great ahas that were attending there, things they'd never thought about before. So that was right. That's what God had led us to do. Those 2 guys I showed in the corner there who were doing some stuff, they actually stayed in our house for a couple of weeks, and others as well. We had constantly had kind of an open house in our house while the temple open house was going on, and we had people coming in differently almost every week. So God was glorified in that, and I look back on this and think, although it was one of the most difficult things I did, going in and sitting in the mayor's office and asking him not to enforce a law so that I could do what God was calling me to do, that was really hard. One of the hardest things I'd ever done. But that's what we need to do, to be respectful in the culture and to appeal down every path you can appeal down and try and work together with the culture that you're in. Now, again, God did not soften his heart, and he was much more intent on figuring out how to get us out of our building than he was on helping us in the outreach. But in the end, God was glorified through some really wonderful conversations. I don't have time to tell you all of them, but some of them were just outstandingly wonderful. And it's because we decided to do the right thing and do it the right way. So there's difficult things. I also never anticipated ever in my entire life calling the ACLU to help me do anything. And a side note on that is a wonderful outcome as well. It turned out that the first time Scott Johnson and I went down to meet the lawyer down in the ACLU headquarters in Salt Lake City. And that was a fascinating thing because typically, if you don't know much about the ACLU, they battle against Christians for a number of reasons. So going into that office down in Salt Lake City, it was like running through a gauntlet, because as we walked back to John's office, which was in the back of the large office center, we had to go through this whole room of about 24 volunteers, ACLU volunteers who were at computers and doing stuff. And as they looked up at us, they gave us this look. They went like this as we walked by. And I wondered, gosh, is this the reception we're going to get from John, the lawyer? No. Like I say, God did a wonderful thing in terms of greasing the skids with John and us. In fact, a year later, Scott Johnson and I decided to go back down and visit our lawyer, John, in the ACLU office because we were on our way to do something else in Salt Lake City for Doris, I think it was. And I said, hey, Scott, we're driving by the ACLU office. Let's just go in and say hello. So this is a year after the decision had been done. So Scott says, you sure you want to do this? I said, yeah. So then we went into the office and again, got that same look from the phalanx of people in front, got back to John's office, got into John's office, he pulled another chair, and the three of us, Scott and me and John, sat there and laughed and enjoyed each other for 45 minutes. And I'm sure the entire office staff heard this and thought, aren't these the Christian guys? And then as the years went on, John actually visited here. He came in here as he came up to do something else for another effort he was working on. He said, can I just drop in and say hi? Sure, I'd love to see you. He came in and we sat in this room in here and had a wonderful yak and enjoyed each other for half an hour. So God does miraculous things in places you would never expect. That's God's wisdom that's in effect, not your wisdom. And God glorifies himself by us just being upright and straightforward and looking for the benefit of the culture as well as the benefit for God's will. It works. So that's the long story short. If you're free, if you're curious about what we're handing out, there's a bunch of these down there next to the floor on the left in the bookshelf under the, and this is something that we worked for about a year with about 10 other organizations to put together and to fund actually. And it's been just really great. Am I done, Jim? Yeah, we're done. We're going to sing.
Can I just add something?
You want to add something? Yeah.
Well, I would just add that connecting to your Daniel connection, we're still here. The city administration has turned over completely, and we are still here.
I shall reiterate this. Yeah, we're still here. We're still here. Just like that last verse we read, Daniel was there for over 4 decades. So, yeah, we're still here. The administration has turned over. It's a different mayor and another mayor and another mayor since that time and another mayor since that time. And so God's blessed us, and we're known as the Popcorn Church in Brigham City because of Peach Days. And so, you just live the life. You live a righteous, obedient life to what God wants and be a light in a dark place, and people see it and God's glorified. So it's a great deal. I don't have anything else to add. Yeah, Doug. Doug does.
Yeah, you said that guy from Idaho that came down here, the guy you used to work with at the LDS. Did the two of you, were you able to go through the temple?
Yeah, we went through the temple together. Yeah. The open house temple. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was awkward. And the amazing thing is he was not a close friend of mine when I worked in industry. I just knew him by name. He was a slight acquaintance inside the company. So I don't know how he knew I was here. I don't know I don't know a lot of the connections, but it was nice to see him again. It was really nice. And we did go through the temple, and I made obvious remarks as we went through, and he explained things to me, which was good. He was a great tour guide in that sense. So, and again, I pray for him all the time. His name comes to my mind. So, yeah. Okay, let's quit. Be a Daniel in this place. Don't be isolated. Be engaged for their benefit and your benefit. Father, we thank you for these words you've preserved for us. And we thank you for encouraging us to follow your loving kindness in the midst of the cultures that we find ourselves in. And Lord, we are thankful that when you look at us, you do see evil. You see sin. You see we were born in this state. And yet at the base of that, you also see something that's very lovable and that only you could see. And you called us to yourself because of that. And Lord, I pray you'd give us that same kind of vision toward the people that are around us. Some of them are just wonderfully warm, delightful people. Some aren't. They're jerks like we were. But God, I pray that you would uniformly, in either case, create in our hearts a heart of great compassion like God did with Daniel and his friends, and a heart that can be constructively engaged for people's good instead of just condemning them outright. So we thank you for your great love for us, because that's what we have experienced with you. We pray that those around us would experience that as your Spirit lives in and through us as we engage with the people and the friends around us. So thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.